All right, welcome everyone to the webinar 8, 10, or 12-hour shifts, reducing overtime through schedule design, solutions for small agencies. This webinar is brought to you by the IACP's Smaller Law Enforcement Agency Program with support from the Bureau of Justice Assistance, Department of Justice. My name is Ben Eklund. I'm the project manager for the Smaller Agency Program, and I'll be the facilitator for today's event. Our panelist for today is Chief Mitch Weinzettel from the Buffalo, Minnesota Police Department. Chief Weinzettel has over 23 years of law enforcement experience, serving as the chief for more than 14 of those. Chief Weinzettel is also the author of Acting Out, outlining specific behaviors and actions for effective leadership. A few of the goals and objectives that we hope to achieve with today's webinar are to explain and discuss the 7K exemption under FLSA rules. We'd also like to explain and demonstrate how overtime reductions and other benefits can occur as a result of using a short schedule in conjunction with FLSA guidelines. We will explain and discuss the nature of various shift rotations. And finally, we'll provide and explain a free schedule tool that you can use for your agency. And this tool will be available for download on the Smaller Agency webpage at no cost to you. At this point, I'm going to pass things over to Mitch.
Well, thanks for the introduction, Ben. We'll go ahead and get started, and as Ben mentioned, there are a series of objectives that we want to go through today. But before we get into that, I want to just add a little piece about a disclaimer. There can be serious implications as it relates to FLSA rules, and they can have pretty significant financial implications for communities that may inadvertently violate those. So although we're going to discuss a series of those laws and rules as relates to FLSA, particularly in the state of Minnesota, it would be a very good idea for you to be sure to check with your legal representative, city or county attorney, whomever might be appropriate for your area before you proceed, just so that you keep yourself out of any problems later on. The other thing I'm going to talk a little bit about is math. And if you're like me, math isn't exactly my strong suit, which is one of the reasons I chose this profession. So just understand there are a series of math issues related to this, and I will be going through those. If you get confused or if something doesn't make sense to you, certainly please check with me offline at a later time, and I'll do my best to try to explain it to you. But as I said, some of those math pieces are a little bit complex, but I think you'll understand as we proceed why that component is so important in terms of understanding how scheduling works. So let's talk a little bit about FLSA rules and kind of how this all works. First of all, the FLSA rule that we're primarily concerned with was created in 1938, and it's Section 207K, which is just often loosely referred to as the 7K exemption. And essentially what it does is it carves out a section of exemptions relative to public safety personnel, particularly police and fire, with respect to overtime and how overtime is incurred. Under that exemption, the FLSA rule essentially creates a work cycle. When we think about overtime in the private sector, typically it relates to a 40-hour work week. But within this rule, FLSA essentially said, look, we understand that public safety has various shift rotations and different ways that they operate in durations and days on and off that don't neatly fit within a 7-day work week. And so because of that, we're going to allow those things to occur in a different format. And so what this exemption allows for is a work cycle which cannot exceed 28 days. Now it's important to understand how that works. The work cycle is a factor of the multiplication of your work rotation. Well, what does that really mean? For example, if you work 4-day on, 3-day off work week, then you can multiply that 4 times and you get 28 days. In other words, your work cycle is actually 28 days, not 7. If you work a 3-day on, 3-day off work cycle, you can multiply that, but you can't exceed 28 days. So the most you could have is 6 days on, or 6 days, 3 days on, 3 days off, times 4, which brings you to 24 days. And that's going to be important because once you understand the length of the work cycle, you can understand how many hours an officer can work within that work cycle before overtime is incurred. So let's just move on to what those work cycles look like. This is a partial list, and the list actually goes much further down in the total work cycle days. But just to orient you to the higher end of that scale, if your work cycle is 28 days, then the maximum number of hours you can have a person work within that period is 171. Similarly, if the work cycle is 27 days, the maximum is 165, and so forth. So as I said, that work cycle is a multiplication of your days on and off. So for example, a 27-day cycle would likely be the result of a work cycle that is 5 days on, 4 days off. So what is overtime? This is a little bit of a difficult question to answer. First of all, understand that you have most likely in your organization some sort of city or county policy or a contract that may express how overtime is calculated and determined. For example, any extension of a work shift might be considered overtime. Or you may have a provision in your contract that says, if you alter my work shift within, let's say, 48 hours or maybe within 7 days of a scheduled shift, then you're going to incur overtime. So it's important for you to understand what those provisions are within your environment as it relates to what overtime is. But under FLSA rules, essentially what they're saying is this. If we think about the work cycle that we just talked about, and let's take the 28-day cycle, overtime is any amount of hours that exceed 171 hours, except, because there's always an exception to these rules, under FLSA, certain hours do not qualify as work hours. For example, vacation time is not considered work hours. Holiday time, if you get time off, is not considered work hours. So in that scenario, for example, if we scheduled an officer for 181 hours within a 28-day cycle, but 10 of those hours were a vacation day, we still would not be incurring an overtime expense because we haven't exceeded 171 actual hours at work. Again, it's a little complicated, and there are some deviations as it relates to training and whether training time counts within that total amount of hours, which also get a little bit complicated. Generally speaking, however, if somebody's doing work, it's considered work hours, and work hours count toward that total amount of allowed hours within the work cycle. Now, the next question is, can employees volunteer time? The answer is both yes and no. Essentially, under FLSA rules, if an employee is engaged in work, which would normally be part of their work day or the type of work they would do for their job, they can't volunteer time. For example, if you have a patrol officer and they volunteer to come in and do a special detail tracking speed limit or speeds of vehicles along a section of the roadway, it would most likely be considered work time. On the other hand, let's say that your organization decides to hold a fundraiser for Special Olympics and that officer volunteers to come in and serve hot dogs at the booth, it probably would not be considered overtime. Again, in both of those circumstances, you just need to be careful about whether or not they're contributing to work that is meaningful toward their job. And if they are, it's considered work hours, and those hours have to be calculated in the total cycle. So let's talk a little bit about where we're going with the philosophy of scheduling. And I think this is really critical for organizations to determine ahead of time. If you're going to sit down and consider a new work schedule, you need to be able to come up with a variety of factors so that you can do it in a way that you're going to be satisfied with. First and foremost, it has to satisfy your organizational goals. If your goals include having 2 officers on each shift, that's important. If your goals include front loading or adding additional shift time where most of your calls are occurring as opposed to looking at 2 officers around the clock, again, you need to be sure that you know what those are going into it. Additionally, the schedule should be flexible for both the organization and the employees. We're going to look at some schedule examples in a little bit, but your schedule does little good for you if an officer takes a vacation day, for example, and everyone else has to adjust in order to accommodate that. So you want to make sure that when you construct the schedule, it works both for you and for the employees. The next piece is it should mitigate the need for overtime, and we're going to talk about that extensively. Essentially, you want to create a schedule that is going to minimize the need for overtime and maximize the amount of service time that your folks put on the street. And then last, should be based on staffing needs related to call volume whenever possible. Obviously, if you want to cover 24/7 and you have very few calls overnight, you're not likely to create a schedule where you don't have anyone on duty overnight. So whenever possible, you want to try to staff relative to where your calls for service are coming from. So I want to talk a little bit about an NIJ study that came out recently which looked at different shift variations as well as some other factors. And I'd like to add at this point, there was also another study that recently came out, and really the information that's coming out of these studies is very similar. And in essence, what they've determined is, number one, the research from this study really showed no appreciable difference in performance, health, or work conflict between 8 and 12-hour shifts. Now those folks that worked 8-hour shifts required the least amount of sleep, but those working 12-hour shifts required greater levels of sleep and actually reported higher levels of fatigue than the other shifts. But this is really the key piece, is that the officers on the 8-hour shifts worked significantly more overtime than those on the 10-hour shifts, and they worked even more overtime than those on 12-hour shifts. So what I take away from this and what the information is from the studies that I've looked at is that when we look at the different shift rotations, really the 10-hour shift has emerged as a primary positive schedule as it relates to the research, the current research that's out there. So the next question I have for you is how many hours do your officers work each year? And when I ask people this question, they almost always say 2,080. And that's because we've always become accustomed to thinking about 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year, and we total that up. But the truth is that's really not true. Although we start out with a schedule with 2,080 hours, it's really not what we end up with as the year progresses. So let's take a closer look at that. We start with 2,080 hours, but we have to, right off the bat, subtract vacation hours. Now this can vary depending upon what your contract says, whether you have a new officer or a senior officer. For example, in my department, the first year the officer only gets 40 hours. Officers that have been here for a long period of time can have up to 160 hours a year. But on average, it tends to be about 80 hours per person or per officer per year. Then there's the notion of holiday hours, and this can vary by agency as well. In my agency, each of our officers gets a day off for each of the holidays within the calendar year. So that means we have to subtract that 80 hours from the 2,080. In other departments, you may have a payout for those holiday hours. So those hours may or may not impact your 2,080, but in a lot of places they do. And then finally, we look at training hours. And again, 40 hours seems to be a general average. You may do more or less than that within your agency, but oftentimes those hours are occurring when the person is on the work schedule. So in terms of hours lost, it's generally around 40, give or take. So when we take these hours and we subtract them from 2,080, what we learn is that the actual hours that one of your police officers are going to work in a calendar year is actually closer to about 1,880, not 2,080. And this seems to be one of the inherent problems with the way schedules are created. schedules are typically overscheduled. In other words, we schedule the officer for 2,080 hours without taking into account that we're going to lose anywhere from 150 to 250 hours per officer per year, and that's really where we start running into some problems. So let me just give you some examples now about how we calculate hours and how this relates to the amount of hours an officer can work or how many officers you might need for your department. So if we're going to look at, let's just take a 24-hour per day coverage. We want to cover a minimum of 24 hours round the clock. That turns out to be 168 hours per week. If we take that and we multiply that out, that's 8,736 hours per year. And if we divide that by 1,880, we come up with 4.65 officers. In other words, if we want to cover 24 hours a day, 7 days a week without fail and without overtime, we're going to need a minimum of 5 officers in order to do that. Let's take another example, and let's say we want to do 30 hours of coverage per day. In that case, we're looking at 210 hours a week. Again, we multiply that times the number of weeks, divide by 1,880, and again, now we're looking at 5.8 officers, and unless you can figure out a way to get a 0.8 officer, you're going to need 6 in order to make that coverage. Again, this is the minimum number of hours or of officers you're going to need in order to cover that 30 hours per day, no matter how you configure those hours, whether you're going to do, 10-hour shifts or what have you. So there are a lot of different rotations that we can consider, but there's also some things that we really should take into account when we're considering how we're going to create the work schedule. One of the things that I've tried to pay particular attention to is rotating days on and off. Of course, if you work a 4 and 3 schedule, you're going to have the same days on and off all the time. That may work for some agencies, but my experience has been that officers get tired of always working the weekends, and invariably your junior officers tend to be in that predicament. If you don't have a lot of turnover in your department, that can be for a very long time. So if you can come up with a schedule that allows for the shifts or the days scheduled to rotate, that can be helpful. The other factor that I think is important is looking at consistency of shifts and rotations. When I first started, we actually progressed through a day shift, a mid shift, and an overnight shift over a 6-week period. And that's hard on staff over a period of time. So the more consistent you can keep the shifts over time, the better. Then there becomes a question of whether or not you want to have a team concept within your agency. Now, depending upon your agency size, depending upon the number of supervisors you have, you may or may not be able to actually use a team concept, or you may. And it really just depends on what your preference is if that's something that you wish to do. One of the other factors that I try to keep in mind is whether or not we're crossing multiple shift or multiple meal periods during a shift. For example, it can be helpful to have a shift that works from 10 a.m. to 8 p.m. because it covers a real good cross-section of the middle of the day. But we're also crossing 2 meal periods, and it's probably one of the least convenient shifts for people. And then, of course, the question is, what are the number of work days? How many days on and off do people want, and what are their expectations in that regard? So let's look at a little bit more math and talk a little bit more about how these rotations work and function. And I understand this is going to be kind of quick, but it's going to become really important a little bit later in the presentation when we start comparing different shift rotations. So if you can bear with me, I appreciate it. So understand that our target goal is between 1,880 to 1,920 hours, give or take. If we take a work cycle of 27 days, so again, this would be, for example, a 5-on, 4-off rotation, we take that 27 days and we divide that into 365 days, and that brings us 13.52 cycles. In other words, that 27-day cycle is going to repeat 13.52 times during the year. So if we then take 1,900 hours, let's just arbitrarily use that as our target number of hours, and we divide it by the number of cycles, that gives us 140.53 hours per officer for each 27-day rotation. Okay, so if we have that number, now we can divide that by 27, and that tells us how many hours maximum an officer can work during that work cycle. Similarly, if we take a 24-day cycle and we divide that into 365, it turns out we have 15.21 cycles in the year. Again, now if we take 1,900 hours and we divide it by 15.21, we learn that the officer can work 124.91 hours for each 8-day rotation. So as we start to build the rotations, we can look at how many total hours we're going to generate. So for example, if we're going to use a 6-day on, 3-day off work shift working 8 hours, that's going to total 1,946 hours. And again, that's 48 hours per 9-day rotation. Similarly, 5 and 4 schedule with a 9.5-hour shift is going to generate 1,926 hours. 5 and 4, as we read down the list, 5 and 4 shift is going to be 1,825. A 4 on, 4 off 10-hour shift is going to be 1,825 as well. And a 4 on, 4 off 10.5-hour shift is going to be 1,916.25 hours. The point here is that you really can't fool the math. No matter how we make these calculations, you still have to try to land in that 1,880 to 1,920 hour area. The rest of the hours up to 2,080 are lost time. And again, just keep in mind that may vary a little bit, particularly as it relates to holiday hours, because if your contract calls for those being paid out independently, of course, those aren't lost hours. It'd actually be in addition. So let's take a look at a few rotations and cycles. And this might be a little bit confusing on the surface, but it'll make a little more sense as I go forward. Whenever I try to construct a new rotation, I always just try to lay it out on paper so I can see where the days on and off work out. So if you look on the left, you have numbers 1 through 9, and those numbers 1 through 9 represent the different officers. So in this case, we would be looking at 9 officers to fill this rotation. If you look at the bottom of this slide, you see the number 5. And what that represents is that for each day, there are 5 different officers that are working that day. So what we've done, if we look at Officer 1 at the top, we can see that the first day on, he's working. He works the first 5 days in a row. He's got 4 days off. He comes back on for 5 days. He's off for 4. He's back on for 5 and off for 4, and so on. As we do that with each of these subsequent officers, you can see that we've created a forward progression. So this particular layout demonstrates a progression where the officers' days on and off would change. Now because of that, and because this is a progressive format, you're not going to have a team structure. In other words, you're not going to have all the same officers typically working the same days with the other officers. Well, let's look at this in terms of what it would look like if we applied actual shifts instead of just numbers. So this is the same model that I just showed you, but now it has the days of the week at the top. And again, the R is for Thursday, the A is for Saturday. And now we've got different shifts. And for the purposes of this schedule, we're going to say that the A shift is your day shift. A B shift is also your second day shift. The M shift is a middle shift. S would be a sergeant shift. And a D would be a dog watch or an overnight shift. So what you can see here is that each of these shifts, as they overlay, you actually have you actually have 4 pure shifts in this rotation. If you look at Officer 1, he's going to be on A shift all the way across. Officer 3 is on a B shift all the way across. Officer 5 is on an M shift all the way across. Officer 7 is on an S shift all the way across. And Officer 9 is on a D shift all the way across. So actually there's 5 pure shifts. The other shifts have a split. Now, when I talked before about maintaining continuity of shifts, one of the things that I think is important is for a shift to always progress forward. So in other words, we wouldn't want someone to work a middle shift and then have to come back on a day shift. So in this case, even though Officer 4 for example, is going to work a B shift or a second day shift for 3 days, then they're going to progress into a mid shift for 2 days. It's fairly palatable for most people to do that. Similarly, if you look at Officer 8, they're working 1 middle shift and then 8 overnight shifts. Again, what you can see in this schedule is it's a forward advancing schedule, which means that the person's days on and off change. So that means they're going to get an actual weekend off from time to time. But one of the detriments of this schedule is that it doesn't allow for a team style or a team concept. The other part with this schedule, which is a little more complicated, and we'll talk about this more when I get into the actual work schedule example, is that this schedule is not quite as conducive to filling shifts. So for example, if we take Officer B, officer number 3, and we were going to put them on training for the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th of the month, or pardon me, the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th, we would have to figure out what are we going to do about that, because it's going to create a gap in our schedule. Now, if we're going to simply use overtime, we could do that, but based on what we're trying to do in terms of reducing overtime, we don't want to do that. So what we want to be able to do is to pull someone in to fill those shifts, and this type of schedule isn't quite as conducive to that. You'll see later in another example when we get into a 4 and 4 schedule that it's much easier to do. But just understand the purpose of having the short schedule is having the ability to pull those hours back in and use people to fill as those shift needs arise. So at this point, I've added in a couple additional officers, and essentially this is the same 5 and 4 rotation as before, but now I've added 2 additional officers. So instead of having an A and a B, we now have 2 A cars. We have also have 2 overnight shifts as well. When you have this kind of a schedule, obviously now it makes it a little bit easier if we have to pull somebody out for training. We can make some shift adjustments, drop the schedule down if our minimum coverage affords us the opportunity to do that. In this particular example, our minimum, our actual per day coverage is 6 officers. So if we're comfortable with only 5, that gives us some flexibility in order to be able to pull someone out of the schedule and not have to replace them. Again, if we have more than 1 person we pull out, then we start getting it starts to become a little more complicated. So now let's take a look at a 6 and 3 rotation. I talked about this early on in the presentation. This is really the minimum number of officers that is needed in order to cover 24-hour without running into a lot of overtime issues. In this case, it's a 5-officer rotation, and what you'll see here is that Officer 4 is working a split shift. He's working 3 P shifts, which is like a power mid-shift, and then an overnight shift. Essentially, those are throwaway shifts because that's a 4th car on that day. Now, the way that this schedule is constructed, you'll also notice that this is a forward advancing schedule. So on some days, you're going to have a P shift on a Friday, Saturday, Sunday. The following week, it might be on a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. That may or may not be what's desired in terms of where we want to put the shift or where we would most like to have the shift. But if we're going to stay in a forward advancing schedule, we may be kind of locked into that type of an arrangement. So I mentioned a 4x4 rotation, and I'll just tell you this is the schedule that my department is on. And in this schedule, what you see is that the officers are scheduled 4 days on, 4 days off, and they're also in a team structure. So it's pretty evident based on the way this schedule is laid out that the odd-numbered officers are on one side of the schedule and the even-numbered officers are on the other side. One of the benefits of this, of course, is continuity of operating with each other, but also from a supervision perspective. Within this schedule and within our department, the S shift represents our sergeant, and it gives that sergeant the opportunity to consistently work with those officers. One of the other benefits of this type of a schedule is that because we operate short, in other words, these officers owe hours back to the department, we can fill in hours as needed when someone takes a vacation or when someone goes on training. And let me just say at this point that sick leave is kind of a different animal. If you run into somebody who calls in sick, you may or may not be able to absorb that, and you may end up with some overtime as a result of that. But generally speaking, sick leave doesn't result in huge numbers of overtime. It's really when we're looking at vacation times or lengthy training, maybe a week-long or a 2-week-long training schedule, where we end up, if we've already used up all of our shift time through a full schedule, now we end up having to try to backfill, and it costs us a lot of money to do that. Okay, so we're going to spend a little time on this slide, and as I said early on, there's a lot of math involved, and I want to walk you through what we're really saying here on this slide. And I know that you can read it on your own, but I want to make sure that I orient everybody to the different aspects of this, what you're seeing here. Along the left, let's just look at the different categories. We have the shift hours, and so that represents the length of the daily shift. The days in the rotation, that includes your days on and off. So if you have 4 days on, 3 days off, 4 days on, 4 days off, etc., that's the number of days in the rotation. The next is the amount of shifts in the rotation, so that we can clearly see that, and then the shifts per cycle. If you remember, I talked about we have to divide the year by the number of cycles in order to determine how many shifts are going to be, or how many hours can fit into each cycle. Then underneath that, we have the FLSA maximum amount of days allowed based on that multiplied cycle. Then I show the cycles per year, the maximum number of hours per cycle, and then there's a little calculation that shows the number of hours that are scheduled if you were to construct your schedule that way based on the shift hours and the number of days that you had to fill. The next item below that are the holiday hours. I'm going to come back to that as we get into the model, but essentially we're talking about whether or not those 80 hours are included as days off or whether they're paid out independent of that. The green bar shows the subtotal hours, so the total number of hours, and again, either inclusive or exclusive of the holiday hours. From there, we've plugged in the vacation hours and the training hours, and then in the blue bar, or the light blue bar, it shows your hour subtotal. And then we take the target hours, which is 2,080, and we provide a differential at the bottom. So I want to first start out with the first two columns, which are 12-hour shifts. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on 12-hour shifts, and part of the reasoning for that is, first of all, you need to have a fair number of officers in order to do that. And actually, in a smaller agency, it's very prohibitive to try to get into a 12-hour rotation. But when you start adding the 12-hour shifts and you start doing the multiplication, you have to get into a deviated cycle in order to get the amount of hours you need. For example, you can't just do 3 days on, 3 days off, 3 days on, 3 days off, because your total number of hours will exceed the amount allowed under FLSA. So what I typically find when agencies are working 12-hour shifts is that they've got some sort of odd rotation. You work 3 days on, maybe 3 days off, then you're back on for 2, off for 2, back for 3, off for 2, and so on. So it becomes a little more complicated in terms of how you put those hours in. Essentially, what it comes down to is that the notion of why you see 3.5 there is because it's almost like 3.5 shifts per week in order to get to the number you need to be at. As you go down, though, once you start calculating that, what you'll see is that if you actually work these 12-hour shifts, you run into some problems with the total hours. And if you take column number 2, you'll see that the hour subtotal is 2,190. You add the vacation hours and training hours, and it puts you well over the 2,080 hours. So from a scheduling standpoint, especially, again, in a smaller agency, unless you have the flexibility to give an officer a day off in the middle of those rotations, their hours are going to be out of whack, and it's just not maintainable. So let's advance to the right, and let's talk about a 4-on, 4-off rotation with a 10.5-hour shift. So we're going to actually be looking now at columns 3 and 4. When we look at these two columns, what you'll see most noticeably is that when you go down to the holiday hours, one of them has 80 hours for holiday and one of them is blanked out. So, for example, if your organization has to give 80 hours off for a holiday or give hours off for a holiday, that means you need to include those 80 hours. If we look at that subtotal now, we're at 1,996 hours. Now if we include the hours for vacation and training hours, we get down to the blue bar and we see that there's 2,116 hours in a calendar year. In other words, you're in the hole by 36 hours before you've even done anything. What that means is your schedule's not going to be short. It's going to be a full schedule. You may or may not be able to maintain that, but the reality is if you need to fill a shift, you're going to have to do it with overtime. Now let's move over to the 4 and 4 where the 80 hours of holiday are not included. So in other words, let's assume that your agency pays out your holiday hours in a lump sum on an annual basis or through some other format, but those 80 hours are not included in the 2,080. Well, at that point, what we can see now is that we get down to the blue bar, your total hours are 2,036, and once we subtract that out, we see that there are owed hours of 43.75 hours. Well, that's not too bad. That actually provides you with a fair amount of hours that are owed back by that officer. Now, I want to talk a little bit at this point about what that really means. When we talk about owed hours, that means that the officer has to work 2,080 hours for the year, but once you construct your initial work schedule, they're going to be short. In other words, if you plugged in all their vacation and training time right away in this scenario, they would only be scheduled for 2,036 hours throughout the calendar year. That means that they owe the department 43.75 hours in order to meet 2,080 hours. So what we're going to do then is, as the need arises, whether that's through training or whether that's through someone who goes on vacation and us plugging that officer in for a secondary shift or for a fill shift, we're going to absorb those 43 hours during the course of the year. And we're going to do that while we keep an eye on their total hours to make sure that they don't exceed the allowed hours under the FLSA rules. And I'll come back to that, so hopefully that's not too complicated. But that's what we mean by scheduling short. So let's move over then to the Buffalo example, which is highlighted in red. And this is how our schedule works. I showed you that rotation before, where we're on the 4-on, 4-off. We work a 10-hour shift, and essentially the days in our rotation are 8. There's 4 shifts per rotation, 12 shifts per cycle, and the maximum number of cycles is 24, or days in the cycle is 24. Now, when we talk about shifts per cycle, this is important now to go back to this whole issue of scheduling short. If I schedule 12 shifts in a 24-day period, that's only 120 hours. That means because the maximum allowable hours are 147, I can actually add an additional 27 hours to that officer's schedule within that work cycle without paying additional overtime. So, for example, I could schedule that officer for 3 days of training for 9 hours each day and not incur overtime. I could schedule them for 2 days to come in and fill a vacation for another officer who's taking leave time, and again, I'm not going to incur any overtime. So as we progress through that model, you can see that in the green bar, the total subtotal hours are 1,905. Now if we take the vacation and training hours, we come to 2,025, and as we subtract that from 2,080, we learn that we have about 55 hours of additional owed hours per officer per year. And as we progress to the right of the model, you can see that there are different models that you can examine. The 5 and 4 model, if you're looking at a 9-hour shift, so this would be the second to the last column from the right. If you're looking at a 9-hour shift, 5 and 4, basically it comes out to the identical type of hours as the 4 and 4 10-hour shift that we're working. So it comes down to a preference. How many hours do you want to have per day? And you can do that math yourself. Again, 6 and 3 shift. One of the things that you run into there, again, is if you look at the bottom of the schedule or at the bottom of this diagram, you're 66 hours over. In other words, a 6 and 3 schedule with 8-hour shifts will get you 24/7 coverage, but it's going to put you over on total hours, and you're going to run into problems if you're trying to fill that later. So again, I know there's a lot of math here, but hopefully you're getting the point. The idea is that at the end of the scheduling, when all is figured in between your holiday hours, vacation hours, and training hours, you really want to be at a point where you're in that 45 to 60 hours owed range per officer per year, and that's going to provide you a tremendous amount of flexibility and save you a lot of money in overtime. So let's talk a little bit more about how do we get there. The first thing that you need to understand is that in order to create a short schedule, you have some factors you have to consider. First of all, you may need to convince your city administrator or manager. And let me just start out by saying this. My police department right now, we have 17 full-time officers. We have 11 officers that are assigned to the patrol division full-time. Our current budget for the police department is about $1.8 million. My general overtime budget right now is $20,500 for the year, or about 1.14% of my total budget. Now, that might seem like a small number, but let me bring this into perspective. I just received information from my finance department about the amount of money that we've spent from January through the end of July of this calendar year. We have spent a total of $6,300 on general overtime. Based on those numbers, we will end the year somewhere in the $10,000 to $11,000 range for general overtime. That's a tiny number, and if your number is significantly higher than that, I'm trying to tell you there's a way to get around that. And city managers and city administrators will be very, very interested in this type of discussion, and this is the way that you can sell it to them very easily. Now, your finance department might take a little convincing as well. One of the things that we do, and I would encourage you to do this if you move in this direction, is to create an 80-hour pay per pay period salary, quote-unquote, structure. But don't be confused by the word salary, but what we're really saying is that regardless of how many hours the officer works per 2 weeks, they're going to be paid 80 hours unless the hours are overtime. So let me give you an example. If we're in January and the way the schedule rotates, the first 12 days of the year, Officer Jones only works 7 shifts. He may have only 70 hours listed on his timesheet, but we're going to pay Officer Jones 80 hours anyway, because whether it's in the second pay cycle or the third pay cycle or whenever that occurs, Officer Jones is going to work 84 hours or 94 hours or maybe even 100 hours. But regardless of how that works, they're going to average 80 hours all the way through the work schedule until the end of the year. And I will show you in a model later how you can monitor this, but your job as the administrator is to track those hours and make sure that everyone ends exactly on 2,080. So again, it might take a little convincing with your finance department, but it's very doable, and they will get this, particularly based on the monetary savings piece. The other piece that you might have some trouble with is the officers and the union. And I can tell you that when I came to my current agency, our work contract did not allow for us to use this type of flexible scheduling. And I had to go to the officers and go to the union in order to get permission to allow us to make that change. And I was able to do that. And I'll show you a little language in a minute here that you can propose to get to that if your contract doesn't currently allow for that. But one of the things you want to do is you want to create buy-in for your officers. And I want to just give you a quick example. I had a conversation with a police chief in another state who was telling me about their budget and the amount of overtime budget they had. This organization had a budget around $2 million, and $400,000 of their budget was for overtime. Now, first of all, that's a very huge number from my perspective, but what's really important here is that if you have $400,000 worth of overtime, that means your officers are working all the time. And it's been my experience that officers enjoy a certain amount of overtime, but at some point it becomes oppressive. So I would argue that one of the things you want to do is take that budgetary amount and reduce that overtime amount to a more manageable number and convince your city manager or city council or maybe county government, whoever that might be, to convert that overtime money into a full-time staff position. So again, you do need to get buy-in from your officers. I will tell you that I've worked a variety of schedules, and I've looked at a number of schedules, and I have had departments that have worked a variety of schedules. The 4-on, 4-off, 10-hour shift schedule that we are using currently in my department has been by far the most widely accepted and desired by our staff, and quite frankly, anytime I start talking about taking it away from them, they get really crabby. So once they get into it, you will find that quickly that they really enjoy it. I also just want to throw in a couple of pieces here. If you look at our overtime budget, you might perhaps wonder to yourself, well, maybe that department just isn't very busy, or maybe they have some practices that allow for overtime to be reduced. Let me just throw in, my agency is a busy agency. We handle on average about 11,000 calls for service per year. We also have a requirement that all reports for calls for service have to be finished by the end of the shift unless approved by a supervisor ahead of time. And although we do from time to time allow officers to hold over a report to the following shift, by and large, the work is getting done on a daily basis by the time they go home. And a lot of that has to do with a philosophy that we have to ensure that officers get their work done right away. The shift overlaps we've created in our schedule that allow for officers that are coming on shift to pick up the new calls that are coming in, which then afford those officers that have been on shift for some time to get the work done that they need to get done. So I mentioned the union language, and this is just an example. This is the actual language that we proposed to our union, which they adopted. The reason that I did this was I came in as the police chief in the middle of the year, and we were not at a point in a negotiation point with our union at that time. So I brought this language to the union, and they adopted a memorandum of understanding right away mid-year. So we didn't have to wait until the negotiation period came around. Ultimately, once we got to that point in the union negotiation piece, the union then went ahead and adopted the language as a permanent part of our contract. So at this point, this is now included in our contract, and they wouldn't be able to remove it without going through some negotiation with the city. So again, this is just one example of language. As I said at the outset, you definitely want to make sure that you're in compliance with any rules and regulations for your state or your city or county, and also that you're not violating any contractual issues as well. So I talked about creating buy-in, and one of the things that you can do to create the buy-in for the officers is to look at some self-imposed restrictions on scheduling changes, including when vacation and leave requests can be made. And let me explain what I mean by that. One of the things that police officers really don't like are surprises in the work schedule. They like to know when their schedule is, and they like to know that well in advance. And if we tinker with the schedule on short notice, oftentimes things that they have planned get interfered with, and that can create frustration. Here within our organization, we set a rule that we will not, unless there's an emergency, we will not adjust the work schedule with less than 30 days notice. Now that also means that the officers had to agree that if they request a vacation leave with less than 30 days notice, it may or may not get adjusted. Now we will, or approved. Now we will still do that if we can reach out to the officer who might be impacted by having to come in and backfill, if that person is okay with it. But generally speaking, by and large, one of the things we've done is said, you know what, we're not going to adjust the schedule with less than 30 days notice, and we're going to put the same onus on you not to make those leave requests with less than that notice either, and that's worked very well. The next thing you can look at is seniority for shift bidding. Maybe you've done this in your department, maybe you haven't, but if you are able to, depending upon how your contract is established, you may be able to afford that as an advantage to the officers going to a new schedule. I already talked about reducing overtime and adding an officer. Again, in the scenario I provided, certainly there could be significant reduction to that overtime budget if they were to add 2 or 3 full-time officers to their staff. And then also you may want to consider an inclusive process to develop the new schedule, but I'm just going to caution you about that. If you're going to invite people in to help you decide what work schedule you might want to go to, be sure and add some provisions or some parameters around which you want them to work. It's really important that if they're going to provide you feedback and input, that you take that and actually do something with it. If there are some areas that you're simply not going to agree to, for example, if you're not going to allow them to go to 12-hour shifts no matter what they want, you want to make that known up front so that that doesn't become a part of the discussion and then a bone of contention later because you won't let them do it. But again, it's a good way to create buy-in, give them an opportunity to talk about it and understand how it can benefit them. Now, I talked about some of these pieces related to short scheduling. One of the pieces, and I can't stress this enough, is that you have to monitor the hours very closely. If you don't want to get sideways with your city administration or your county administration or your finance department, you need to stay on top of this. And part of the reason for this is you don't want to get into November and realize that an officer owes you 60 hours, but there's no possible way you can include those hours because there's not enough room within the FELSA guidelines for those hours to be included. So you have to be very careful. Number 2, you need to adjust the hours at year end. Typically what I do is I get officers within about 8 to 10 hours at the end of the year. Maybe we add an extra shift. In some cases I'll give officers the opportunity to take a vacation day or take vacation time. Perhaps their total hours for the year end are 2,074, for example, and I'll give them the option. They can come in and work a short shift for 6 hours to work traffic, or they can take vacation. And oftentimes they'll just put in for 6 hours of vacation to get squared on the hours. The other way that you can do it, if the hours are short, if it's a small amount, maybe it's 1 or 2 hours, you can offer them an opportunity to extend a shift for a half hour, 2 or 3 days in a row to pick up that extra hour and a half they need. Again, just be accommodating and considerate of your staff and your scheduling practices. Nothing will turn them away or frustrate them more if you're making adjustments on short notice. Again, scheduling for long periods of days on and so forth. So just be aware of those pieces. So kind of transitioning into this next section, we're going to provide a variety of files to you that you can use in conjunction with this webinar and with this program. And these schedule files, as Ben mentioned at the beginning of the program, are going to be available for you on the IACP website. First of all, there are some FLSA documents that outline the legal provisions and the legal language that I provided to you already. So if you thought I kind of glossed over that or you didn't get all the information you need, just understand you can look at those documents that I've referenced and get the information that you need. I'm also going to provide you with a series of Excel spreadsheets, and these are essentially the free schedule program that I talked about. I will tell you, you definitely need to have a little bit of understanding of how to run Excel in order to do this, but I've been using this Excel spreadsheet for more than 20 years, and it's worked very well for me. I also included a very detailed PDF with step-by-step instructions about how you construct the work schedule using these Excel spreadsheets, and as well as a series of schedule descriptions and examples. For the purposes of this program, I'm going to give you a little snapshot of what these spreadsheets look like and what the schedule itself looks like. I won't go into great detail, but you should be able to get some general reference in terms of how these things look when you go to open them up. So now I recognize there's a lot of things going on in this slide, so we're just going to kind of take this left to right, and then we'll kind of work down from there. So at the top left, you'll see that the month of January is in a rectangle. So what you're really looking at here on this is a screenshot of 1 month of work schedule. As you go to the right, you'll see the numbered days, 1 through 31 for January, and you'll also see right below that the days of the week all in lowercase. So you've got Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and so forth. The first oval has a target. If you take 2,080 hours and you divide it by 12, it comes out to 173 hours. So essentially each month, what we're really looking for is for an officer's total hours to be 173 hours per month cumulatively as we go forward. And I'll show you that in another slide. The hours column, which is the second oval, shows the actual number of hours that officer is scheduled for that month. And again, that's cumulative. So if we were in January, it would show the total hours from January plus February. As we move to the right, the first circle says total hours at the end of cycle. And then the next one says total hours at end of cycle. So you have 2 columns there, and this is really important to understand. The FELSA guidelines say there can only be a certain number of hours within a work cycle. That means that we need to monitor how many hours are within a block of days. Those days don't necessarily track with the days of the month. They're going to cross over from month to month. So in this example, if you look right in the middle of the schedule, right on days 18 and 19, you'll see a long rectangular box, and there's a line running right through the center of it. That line represents the end of the cycle. So if we look at Officer 1, which you can see the large oval to the left shows the number of officers on this schedule. If we look at Officer 1 and you track over to the right, you will see that there are a series of A's listed prior to that line. If we track all the way over to the total hours end of cycle in the first column of those, you'll see a number of 110. That means that there are 11 shifts or 11 10-hour shifts or 110 hours total that are scheduled for that officer within that work cycle. Now we'll see there's also, in addition to the A's, which represent a shift, on this schedule there's also an H, which represents a holiday. And if I forgot to mention it earlier in terms of what are considered work hours, a holiday not worked is not considered work hours. So just like vacation hours or sick leave hours, holidays not worked are not considered work hours for purposes of calculating overtime under FLSA. They still count for total hours toward 2,080, but not necessarily for calculating overtime. So if we go down to Officer B, for example, now we can see there's an H on January 1st. We have a series of 4 A's, another series of 4 A's, and now there's nothing else before the line. So if we go all the way over to the total hours end of cycle, you'll see that there's a 90 there, representing a total of 90 hours within the work cycle. And again, we can do that for each. Now the reason why the total hours end of cycle second column is blank is because there's only one cycle that ends in this month. So in this particular example, what we're seeing is for the month of January, there are 18 days in this cycle, but there would actually be an additional 6 days from December of the prior calendar year that would make up the total 24 days within the work cycle for our work schedule. Hope that makes sense. If, for example, this work cycle ended on January 2nd, we would then have 2 days in January that are part of the cycle and 22 days in December, but then you would actually see another line blocked on December 26th because we would then have January 3rd through the 26th representing another 24-day cycle. And in that example then, we would see the total hours end of cycle in the second column. There would be numbers there as well. I also want to point out in the middle of the schedule there is a large circle, and this is really where you're going to schedule all of your work shifts. So in this example, again, this is a 4-day on, 4-day off example. You can see that there are 4 A shifts. Now we're looking at Officer 1. There's 4 A shifts, 4 days off, and then they're back for 4 A shifts. Similarly, if you scroll down, you'll see that B, S, P, and D in that same oval all have the same days on and off because that's part of that team schedule based on the 4-and-4 rotation that we're using. Now let's take a quick look at a vacation, and you can see if we look at Officer 7 and Officer 9, you'll see that there are Ds that are added into the schedule, and that's because Officer 10 has taken a vacation. I'll come back to that in a minute when you can see it a little more clearly. We're also going to look at the same thing with Officers 1 and 2 as it relates to a shift trade, and then with Officer 3 and Officer 4 as it relates to a training day and a fill shift. Before I get into that, I want to just real quickly talk about the legend of this schedule program. What you see at the bottom left in the large oval is just a listing of all of the shifts. So you can see the A shift for our department is a 6 a.m. to 4 p.m. shift. The B shift is an 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. shift, and so on. Understand that the way this schedule works within the Excel files is that an alpha character, either a lowercase or an uppercase alpha character, is actually associated with a number. So when the schedule calculates, it will actually convert a D, for example, to 10 hours. For our school resource officers, which work an 8.5-hour shift, you'll see right in the middle of that oval that they use a large letter Y or an uppercase Y to express an 8.5-hour shift. So our schedule will calculate a Y as 8.5 hours. Again, those are completely definable based on what you want to establish, and you'll actually set those up when you create the schedule. Also, in the oval to the right, you'll see there's a short list of the FLSA cycle days, 28, 27, and so forth. The reason for that is, for example, our office staff and our detectives work on a 5-day on, 2-day off or 28-day cycle versus our patrol officers who work a 4-and-4 24-day cycle. So those numbers are just there for my purposes or for anyone else's purposes that are working with the schedule so that you can pay close attention to the total number of hours within the FLSA cycle. So I want to talk quickly about the vacation, and let's go back now to the example from the January that I showed you. What you can see here is that Officer 10 has put in for a week off. So they're taking 4 days off, and we've represented that by a V for each of those shifts. What that means is that we're missing 4 overnight shifts. In this example, what we've done then is we've taken Officer 7 and added 2 shifts to the end of their cycle, and we've taken Officer 9 and we've added 2 shifts to the beginning of their cycle. Note that for Officer 7, they're working at power mid-shift going into an overnight shift, so again, they're moving forward in the shift. And for Officer 9, they're actually working overnights anyway, so using the 2 overnight shifts on the front end of their shift doesn't cause a problem for their sleep pattern. Now, if we're going to look at a training day, let's say that Officer 3 is going to go to a 1-day training. We can put a T in for Officer 3, which in our schedule will be calculated as a 9-hour shift, but now we're going to have a hole in the schedule. So similar to the vacation, we're just going to add one additional shift for Officer 4. We're going to put them on a B shift, which is the shift that was vacated by Officer 3. Now let's say that another officer wants to take a day off, but they don't want to use vacation. They want to switch a shift with another officer. So let's say that Officer 1 wants to take January 26th off. What you'll see is that there's an ampersand placed in that box. That ampersand is not calculated by the schedule. So for the schedule, it looks at that as a 0. But what I've done then is I've added an A shift for Officer 2. Now I've gone back over to Officer 2 on January 22nd, put an ampersand there, and now I've placed an A shift for Officer 1. So essentially they just decided to switch a day. It is very important to keep an eye on this and make sure that these shift changes occur within the same shift block. They don't have to necessarily, but if they don't, sometimes it can put the officer over on total hours, which then would force you to pay overtime. So I make it a practice when officers want to do a shift swap that they make the swap within the same shift block. And again, that's within that cycle period established by the FLSA, again, based on the number of rotation days that you're going to establish. One other nice thing about Excel is that you can assign a shift note, or you can just add a note onto the work schedule. And the way that you do this simply is you go to the cell or to the box that you want and you right-click. And when you do that, a little menu will pop up and it'll just say Add Comment. When you click on that, it will open up this box. In this case, what you can see is I've added a note that says Off for Hours. So for example, I have a school resource officer who has worked extra hours as a part of their work assignment, and it just so happens that there's not going to be school on December 26th or December 27th. So in this case, I just haven't scheduled them for those days because, as you can see, their total hours for the year are already sitting at 2,074.5. So I don't need to have them scheduled for a regular work shift, and in fact, if I did, it would put them over the total for the year. So it's just a way that you can add notes to yourself. We use this in our department to add notes about court dates or a variety of different things that you might want to add. Maybe you're going to have a department meeting. You can add a shift note for that. Perhaps you're going to have schedule a shoot and you want to put the time of the shoot or even the schedule for the shoot in a note. You can add that. So finally, when it all comes together, this is what a very complicated schedule would look like, I imagine, from your vantage point. But if you look at this, and I'm not going to go over the whole thing, but just to kind of orient you to a few things quickly, if you look at the orange bar on February 9th, for our purposes, that represents a department meeting. So anytime we see an orange bar, we know that that's either an all-department training or a department meeting. If you go further to the right, on the 20th of February, where you see the large blue bar, that's a holiday. If you see on the schedule where there are gray boxes, typically that's when somebody has made a request to have days off blocked. In other words, look, I'm going to go on vacation. Could you please block these days so that if you're looking at doing fill shifts at some future point, you don't plug me into one of those days because I'm going to need those days off. I try to be very accommodating with those, also explaining to people that, you know, in a pinch, they might be asked to fill one of those shifts, but that's why the gray boxes are there. And again, you can look at the target hours. I mentioned 173 per month. Since we're in February, now it's 346. And again, here, if we're looking at in the hours column, you can see now the cumulative total of hours that each of these officers have worked from January to February. Again, there are a number of things that are filled in. For example, if you want to look at Officer 421, the last officer in the list, if you go over to February 11th and 12th, you'll see that there are 2 B shifts plugged in there. That's because Officer Kitzman, number 416, had to take those days off for military leave. And again, all of these adjustments are being made without incurring any overtime whatsoever. So that's a pretty quick overview of how short scheduling works, how we calculate total hours, and create that shortage of schedule so that we can backfill those hours in the schedule to avoid paying overtime. You can see my contact information on the screen in front of you. Again, the files that you may need are going to be on the IACP website, and you can access those. And again, there's a very extensive PDF tutorial that will walk you through how you use those files and how you fill them in. And if you have any questions about the presentation or any questions about how the short scheduling works and so forth, you can contact me through the contact information that's provided. Ben, do you have some additional comments?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Mitch. A lot of good information there for smaller agencies. We just want to thank everyone for watching this webinar. We do hope it was helpful to better your understanding of schedule design. Like Mitch said, we are providing contact information for both Chief Weinzettel and smaller agency staff. So again, if you have any questions in the future, or if you would like to talk about the possibility of requesting a technical assistance outreach related to today's topic, we can discuss that. And like Mitch said, the resources related to the webinar today will be found on the smaller agency webpage. If you have any difficulties accessing those resources, you can contact the IASP staff. Thank you again, and stay safe out there.